I was going deaf.
Became very isolated.
So I had to admit to myself that I was deaf.
Your brain is where you hear. The ear and all the nerves are just the transmitters.
So I'm just going to go ahead and keep talking.
I had a horrible time understanding speech.
Can you hear?
It's good.
With hearing aids, your hearing is only going to get worse. With a cochlear implant, your hearing is going to get better over time.
The hearing loss isolates you from the world, and cochlear implants let you come back.
It's just amazing.
Yes, it's good.
Hi, my name is Karen, and I'm deaf, but I can hear quite well, actually. This is because I have 2 cochlear implants. You might ask, what is a cochlear implant? Well, that's why I'm here, along with my guest, who will join me shortly. Together, we will explain not only what a cochlear implant is, but how they work and why more and more people are getting implanted, as we like to call it, because that's what it is. But before I get ahead of myself, I'd like to start by sharing a little bit about myself and how I lost, then regained my hearing. I had absolutely normal hearing until I turned 47 years old. I woke up one day and noticed that things sounded distorted. I went to the ENT and was told I had more than likely contracted a virus that attacked my inner ear and resulted in profound loss in my left ear. I was shocked. Thankfully, my right ear was fine. So I was fitted with a hearing aid in my left ear, and this worked fine for a while. But as the years went on, I started developing other hearing-related issues such as vertigo and fluctuating hearing loss, as well as sudden drops in my hearing. I eventually needed hearing aids in both ears. By this time, I was seeing an otologist, which is a step up from an ENT. I was diagnosed with either Meniere's disease or inner ear autoimmune disease. My doctor wasn't sure. Either way, it didn't matter to me. I was going deaf, and it was very scary. It was becoming more and more difficult in my life to live like I knew it. I couldn't hear in restaurants or in noisy places, and let's face it, life is noisy. I struggled on the phone and needed closed captioning to watch TV. Going to movies was out, attending social gatherings was no fun, concerts, book clubs, lectures, none of it worked. My world was becoming smaller and smaller. Even doing my job was hard because I couldn't hear. And to make matters worse, I started feeling like I was losing my intelligence, in part because I was missing so much. When you can't hear, it's harder for your brain to process and store memory. It was depressing and isolating. As my hearing declined, I remembered my otologist telling me very nonchalantly, well, if your hearing gets worse, you can just get a cochlear implant. I thought, what? No way. Cochlear implants are for deaf people. Well, right before I turned 60, I ran the Portland Marathon. I no sooner crossed the finish line and I had a horrible bout of vertigo and nearly lost all of my hearing in my left ear. I had, in an instant, become a candidate for a cochlear implant. So what does becoming a candidate for a cochlear implant mean? It's when your hearing aids are no longer helping enough for you to communicate. An evaluation is needed by a specialist to determine if you meet the criteria for insurance or Medicare to pay, which they will if you qualify. This might be a good time to explain what exactly a cochlear implant is. Many people like me suffer hearing loss because hair cells in their inner ear or cochlea are damaged. The implant replaces the function of the damaged inner ear. Unlike hearing aids, which make sounds louder, a cochlear implant replaces the damaged part and provides sound signals to the brain. This is a sound processor. It is worn behind the ear. It captures sound and turns into digital code. This is the battery here. It powers the entire system. It's rechargeable. This processor transmits the digitally coded sound through the coil on the outside of a recipient's head to the implant. There's a magnet here, and inside each recipient's head, there's a magnet as well. Let me show you mine. Here's my magnet, and it sticks on my implant that's right there. Pretty cool, huh? So anyhow, back to my story. I was naturally very nervous about getting a cochlear implant, in part because there are risks involved, as there are with any surgery. I was afraid to lose what little hearing I had. This is called residual hearing. Even though my left ear was basically shot, I could still hear sound, and that was important not to lose. But it also was very important to understand what people were saying. I knew I needed to hear better, and I really wanted to hear my grandkids. You know, they have those sweet, small little voices. I was missing their precious words. So I decided to go ahead and have the surgery. Turns out it was a good thing that I had the surgery when I did, because 5 days later, I lost almost all the hearing in my other ear. Needless to say, I was very motivated to get this cochlear implant up and running. So what does up and running mean? In a word, it's called activation. It's when you receive the outer part of the cochlear implant. This is when the audiologist literally turns you on. I knew what sound sounded like, so it was a matter of reintroducing a new sound to my old brain. When I was first turned on, I heard what sounded like Morse code beeping.
Okay, I'm gonna start turning it up, okay? So I'm just gonna go ahead and keep talking.
Can you hear?
It's good. What does it sound like?
Well, like static, kind of a higher static, like
Yeah.
almost like a Morse code.
Yep. And it's
But
amazing.
it's not horrible.
It's gonna become speech very quickly.
I'm going to hear speech.
That's what that is. That's my voice. It's your voice. That's what you're hearing, but your brain doesn't realize it yet.
I'm hearing your voice. That's your voice.
That's my voice.
How come it doesn't sound like when you're talking?
Many people notice a little bit of a delay, but over time your brain corrects it. And the other thing is you're hearing through electricity, not through the air like we normally do. So your brain doesn't understand what it's hearing, but it will. Yeah.
By the end of the day, I was starting to barely hear a whisper of a word. Each day, I could understand more and more as my brain adapted. Of course, it's different for everyone, and much depends on how long you've been hearing impaired, if you've been wearing your hearing aids, and of course, doing the rehabilitation. It's amazing to me what your brain can do. That plasticity thing, it really exists. About 1 year later, I was ready to get my second cochlear implant. I'm happy to report my second cochlear implant was a breeze, relatively speaking. I was the first surgery of the day and was home by noon. When I was activated, I started hearing words after about 15 seconds. It was amazing. This was because my brain knew how to do a cochlear implant.
It's turned on. Can you tell something's going on?
And it's like electronic voice, like a robot talking loud. It's really weird. It's so different than this first one.
It sounds like you're hearing voices.
I am.
They sound funny, but you're hearing voices.
I'm hearing robots. That's what I'm hearing.
I'd say that's a huge success.
I would say so too. Yes, it's good. Granted, at that time, everyone sounded like a robot for a while, including me. But it didn't take long, maybe a month, before people started sounding like themselves. It's nothing short of a miracle, and that is why if you meet someone with a cochlear implant, they generally don't mind sharing their story. Despite losing our hearing, most of us are pretty happy campers. This is because we have gained something we had once lost, and we all know what that feels like. And now you are about to meet 3 of these happy campers. Hello again, we're back, and I'm very happy to introduce three wonderful people who all have cochlear implants. Charlie here has had his cochlear implant. I thought it was for 16 years, but actually it's been more like 9. And Charlie's from Salem. And we have Gary, who's from Vancouver, Washington, and Marcy from Portland. And I'm going to just start right off by asking Charlie, could you tell me a little bit about your hearing loss journey?
Yes, I started losing my hearing in my 30s. I'm now 71. And it was gradual. Started off, I could still use the phone, but I couldn't hear in noisy situations. Then when I was about time I turned 40, they decided I needed a hearing aid. So I started with a hearing aid in my left ear. It just gradually kept getting worse. I could hear less and less until about the time I turned 60, I could not use a phone. Even I had the most powerful hearing aids. They were in both ears. I was just struggling. And then when I was about 62, got my first implant, and it was just wonderful for me. It was a little strange. The voices sound kind of strange when you first get the implant, but it rapidly increased. And I got my second one about 5 years later. I would have gone sooner, but we had other medical issues in the family at that time. So now I have 2 implants, and I couldn't be happier.
Great. Well, thank you. Gary, would you like to share your story?
Oh, certainly, Karen. I started to lose my hearing in 1989, and I didn't find out for 3 years till I finally diagnosed that I had Meniere's disease. And that affects both your hearing and your balance. And that progressed, got worse and worse in the one ear, and then 9 years later in 1998, it had started in my other ear. And I never actually wore a hearing aid on the first side that went bad because it just so quickly got distorted. So much distortion that if they amplified it, it would just confuse my brain more. So the second ear, about 3 or 4 years after it started going out, I did start wearing hearing aids on that side. And that's around the time that I just lost music. Music was completely shot for me. It was totally worthless for me to try to listen to music. It was just garbage. And I went for 9 years like that with no music, and about a year or 2 after that, I just simply had a horrible time understanding speech, and became very isolated. You go to a grocery store, and when you're at a checkout line, the clerk's going to say either, did you find everything you're shopping for, or do you have a rewards card? And I wouldn't be able to figure out which of those 2 phrases they were saying. So it's very isolating, and I would go to a store with my wife with me simply so she could deal with those questions for me. And finally in 2009, I had a cochlear implant put in on one side. And the reason I did one is the Meniere's disease had wiped out the hearing basically on both ears, but it had wiped out all of the balance function on the right side and left me with maybe 5% of normal balance function on the left side. So I knew that I had no hearing on the left side, and when they put the implant on the right side, it would wipe out my residual hearing at that point in time. So I knew that going into the surgery I would be deaf coming out. What I didn't know was whether the implant would work or not. And it worked wonderfully, and
Wow.
I'm completely happy about it.
That's a great story. Thank you. Marcy, how about you?
Well, I started losing my hearing on one side, my left side, when I was about 48. And what happened was I came back from a cycling vacation. I went to pick up the phone to call friends and catch up with people and tell them about my trip. And I couldn't hear anything on the left side. And I was, of course, very upset and very nervous about the whole thing. I saw a doctor and had my first hearing test, found out that my hearing had looked like a cookie cutter on the hearing chart, like a big bite out of the hearing chart. And so I saw several specialists. No one could figure out exactly what the cause was. Eventually the hearing actually came back. But then it began to diminish gradually over a period of years. And then the same thing started to happen on the right side, not to the same extent, but also coming and going, losing it, and then coming back. And this was particularly true after a couple of surgeries that I had. So I wondered if it was the anesthetic that was involved or any ototoxic medications that I had been taking. It was very disturbing, and none of the specialists that I saw, I went to almost every neuro-otologist in town, could figure it out. So over the period of time, I had a whole series of hearing aids getting progressively more powerful. Hearing aids, it began to affect my work, it began to affect my social interactions with people. If I was on a Sunday hike with my hiking group, they would be talking and I couldn't understand what they were saying, and people would start saying things like, oh, I'll tell you later, or it wasn't important, or it didn't matter, but it was very important to me. And I gradually began to feel more isolated, even though I had actually been fairly extroverted in my life and career professions before that. So finally, my hearing got to the point where the audiologist I was seeing said she couldn't do anything more for me. And so I started checking out cochlear implants. I was tested. I was on Medicare at that point, and on the first round I did not qualify because Medicare actually has a higher standard, or you might call it a lower standard of hearing,
Right.
to get qualified than some private insurers have. So I got another more powerful set of hearing aids, which helped me along for a while. And then eventually I had a second test, and I did qualify actually in both ears. And so I did a lot of personal research. Karen was very helpful. Charlie was very helpful, among a number of other people that I talked to. And I was somewhat concerned about the loss of what residual hearing I had. So I selected a doctor who had a reputation for preserving that. And eventually, after a lot of stops and starts and considering whether I wanted to go forward with it, I did have the surgery, and I was extremely pleased with the result of that. But for a while I still maintained the hearing aid in my right ear. And then eventually that I began to realize that wasn't going to be getting any better, it was only going to be getting worse. And so another process took place in which I eventually decided to become bilateral, which was actually just this past November. And I've been extremely pleased with the results and being able to hear out of both sides now. It's been a tremendous improvement in my life.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a great story. I'm hearing just a theme about everybody's got their unique story, but the one thing that's the common thing is, you're just holding on to your residual hearing because it is, even though it's bad, you don't want to lose it. But one of the first things I did after I had my second cochlear implant was to have my husband turn on the fire alarm, the smoke detector, to see if I could hear it, and I could. So I have some residual hearing, not very much, but since we're talking about that hearing that you have left, Charlie, do you have any residual hearing left?
Well, my hearing was, before I got the implants, was so bad I was not worried about the residual. And when I got my first hearing implant on the left side, I lost anything that was left. But it didn't really bother me because there wasn't much left.
Right.
On the right side, it was interesting. I have what they call basically a full-length implant. They were not expecting or trying to preserve any residual hearing. But after I got my implant and the processor active, I found out I did have some residual hearing. So on my right side, I have like a hearing aid part. It actually goes into my ear, and it only works on bass tones, which is the last thing you lose. I don't hear the alarms in the house when I take my implants off. It's interesting though, in the last 6 months we've gotten a dog, and if she wants to get up, I can hear her bark.
It's
So
that brain plasticity.
It was a shock to me
Yeah.
that I could do that. But
Right.
so yeah, I have a little bit of residual, but my hearing was so bad it was not a concern.
And Gary, you have none, right?
In terms of residual hearing in the implanted ear, I have 0. I mean,
Right.
that's been wiped out. On the unimplanted side, just like Charlie, the only thing I can hear is my dog if he decides to bark right next to me.
Also, in just thinking about the support, and when you make a decision to get a cochlear implant, and I'm assuming that most people that are watching this are people that either are hearing impaired, maybe wearing hearing aids, or they know somebody that does. So it's a big decision to get a cochlear implant. And for me, one of the things I did, aside from just getting online and reading up about it, I attended a support group meeting in Tigard, and that's where I very first met Charlie. He was one of the first people that had a magnet on his head, and he was very helpful for me. And I was just wondering, would any of you like to just answer what you did for your support or to make decision in your research?
Well, I did a lot of research, both online and talking with people, and through friends. You were one of the first people that I met, Karen, and you were really very gracious about it. I think I met you actually after one of your appointments at the hospital.
That's right.
And you even let me touch your
My bumps?
surgical area, your bumps, and you showed me the device, and we talked about how it worked and your experience and your impact. And I talked to probably maybe 10 or 11 people altogether. And so that support was very important. Plus, we have a group session every other month in Tigard, which is also very helpful, both on the technical side as well as meeting other people and sharing experiences. And then there are multiple online groups as well. And the result of that is that I think you become really motivated towards helping other people, and so there's a whole volunteer experience that happens as well, and I think all of us share that and like to get involved with it. But I think the support was very important, especially as you're getting closer to those surgical date and for the first time, and getting cold feet at various times and making that ultimate jump into having this surgery.
Yeah, it's a big
Support
is huge. Support is huge. This is probably a good time to mention that we are all Cochlear volunteers. Cochlear is the brand that we all have. There's a couple other brands that are available, 3 altogether. But but I just thought I would throw that in. Gary, how about you?
Like you, I also wanted to meet somebody that had a cochlear implant. That was mind-boggling. The first time I met someone who was actually wearing a cochlear implant and I could understand what they were saying. And I knew I wanted one because, I mean, my hearing was totally worthless at that point in time. And for me, the big decision was the brand. And I'm an electrical engineer, so I got very involved into the circuitry and the processor and in the implant. And I mean, I was reading engineering journal articles about cochlear implant circuit design, and the poor lady at Cochlear, I just pummeled her with so many questions that she finally got me in touch with one of the engineers at Cochlear.
Wow.
And I think from what I've heard from other people, it kind of blew his mind, the questions I was asking him. But nevertheless, with input from him and also the fact that my neurologist that did my surgery is also a professor of bioengineering, and he was able to answer some more questions. Between him and the engineer at Cochlear, I had everything resolved and finally decided that Cochlear was the brand for me. And
wow, that's so interesting to hear about the type of research that you did. I mean, for myself, I was mostly just wanting the support, you know.
yeah,
and you were getting more into the analytical parts and the physiology of
everybody's different. I've actually run into people who made their choice based on the color of the external processor.
Well, I think the relationship with a surgeon also, you know, the confidence that you have in the surgeon, that was very important to me. I had someone that I could relate to and who answered my questions, because even though I'm not an electrical engineer, I did have a lot of technical questions about it and how it would work and what happens with the residual hearing and that sort of thing. So I think that is important too.
Yeah. Charlie, did you want to add anything?
I had about a 20-year relationship with my audiologist. I get all my care from the VA. I spent a career in the Navy. And so when they told me they couldn't help me with the hearing aids anymore and suggested this, first thing I did is contacted some of my old Navy friends, and I found some people there through email, and that was the first contact. And I got pros and cons. On general, I didn't even know about the brands at that time. Then the surgery was done in Seattle, and the closest VA at that time where I could get the implant was in Seattle, and that audiologist put me in touch with somebody here in Oregon, actually in Lebanon. And we got together. This gentleman was, I believe, in his mid-80s. He was just getting ready to get his second implant. He was a choir director, musician, and so he was able to tell me the whole story about how he could hear. You know, I read enough that I knew the technology had been around a while. It was solid, but getting this relationship with somebody who had it and it was working well. So, and then I don't think I went to any support group. Didn't know about the support groups at that time, but yeah, talking to somebody or emailing somebody, I just brought the comfort level right up.
Right, and I just want to add again, I mean, because we all have Cochlear brand, Cochlear implants, the support that Cochlear offers has been wonderful.
Yes.
I mean, if I ever had any questions, and you can imagine, as you all know, you have questions, or maybe you have a problem with your processor, you can call, and there's somebody who's just on the phone, and that's kind of huge when you're talking about your.
I have to admit too, the surgeon I went to and the audiologist that the first time, that was the only brand they did. Now they do all brands, and there's more of a choice. So I was lucky in that I just kind of went through the process and ended up with what I think is the right one.
Right.
The other thing is, I remember the thing that really sort of was the icing on the cake. It was a dinner at your house, and one of the other people that was there said she was also a recipient of the technology. And she said, with hearing aids, your hearing is only going to get worse. With a cochlear implant, your hearing is going to get better over time. And if you do the training and do the work, you will, have a really positive result. And that kind of really resounded with me. It was like someone finally capturing it. And my hearing had gotten so much worse over the years, and hearing aids just weren't helping anymore. And I wanted to do something that was actually going to, where I could see progress and results for the future, and it turned out to be that way.
Right, yeah. I mean, we are going to be, when we're in our 90s and we're in assisted living, we'll be able to hear better than anybody.
Well, every time I would meet somebody at a coffee shop or, someplace to find out about how they worked, how their process worked with getting a cochlear implant, they could always hear so much better than I could. It was frustrating.
Yes, it is, yeah. I think that most people that are interested in cochlear implants have hearing aids, so Let's talk a little bit about how that's different. How the sound was different. Marcy, you were saying that you know about being able to hear better. So that's one thing. You're not waiting for your hearing to go down. It's just going to get better.
Yeah.
But could you share a little bit about that?
Well, at first I did my worst side first because I did have more residual hearing on my right side. And so I still had my hearing aid, which was a pretty high power hearing aid. And actually I think it helped me at that point because my brain was learning sound in a different way, electronically rather than, you know, in the normal way through the little cilia that are in your cochlea. And so my right ear, I feel, helped me to train my left ear with whatever residual hearing I had there, and I came up pretty quickly in the training that occurred. However, I knew that I still, you know, once my hearing on the left side really improved, there was an imbalance there because I could hear so much better. And, you know, after the first, you know, month or so of semi-robotic hearing, it began to sound completely normal, which it really still does now. But yet the right side, which had a little bit more fullness to the sound, it still made me feel very imbalanced. And so this past summer, before deciding to get a second implant in my right side, I tested several ReSound brand hearing aids, which are complementary to the Cochlear brand implant that I have. I tried several different ones, and it just wasn't satisfactory. And so that was the ultimate decider. I realized that my hearing was really not going to be improving on the right side. The hard part in making that decision was I had to admit to myself that I was deaf. Because as long as I had that hearing aid, I was holding on to the last shred, and I think you understand that, you know, feeling like maybe I wasn't really deaf. And so
That's
once
right.
I got over that sort of emotional hump and decided to have the second surgery, which I had just earlier last winter, it was this side, the right side, started to come on pretty quickly as well because my brain was already trained, and it made it a lot easier. I'm still coming up on that side. It's not to the positive extent that I have on the left side, but I feel like that will continue to improve with additional training.
And time.
Yeah.
I think generally that what I've heard is it takes about a year before you really get to where you're going. Well, not necessarily even where you're going to be, because it just continues to improve.
But like you have said before, you know, I don't have to always have people on my left side anymore. You know, if I'm riding my bike and then someone is trying to talk to me, you know, it was very difficult before I had the second implant, and now it's greatly improved.
And it just the whole thing about loss. You know, just waiting to lose more hearing. It's just, it's very depressing. And so for me at least, that was one of the things, the positives was I don't have to worry about that now. It's just up from here.
Yeah.
So Charlie, would you like to?
Well, I think it's important to realize the difference is hearing aids are just trying to make the sound louder to use the cilia in your cochleus that gets the sound to the nerves, and they just don't regenerate. So you can just get louder and louder. You're never going to get better. The Cochlear implant, it's laying right on basically on the nerves, and as it settles in and everything, it can only get better. And that it's just amazing. I mean, I wore my right hearing aid all the time until I got the second implant. But when I was doing testing and using both the implant and the hearing, I scored worse with the hearing aid. But I kept wearing it because it was a crutch.
Well, and wasn't the other reason, I mean, you bring up a really good point. For people that are wearing hearing aids and are maybe thinking, oh, these aren't even working, and then they don't use them, could you want to expound on why that's important to continue wearing your hearing aid?
Well, I think like Marcy said, the having both ears makes it easier when you do get implants to learn. Your brain is where you hear. The ear and all the nerves are just the transmitters. And if you go longer you go without hearing, the harder it is to learn to hear again. So I think keeping that hearing aid in, like Marcy did, it kept my brain working over there, even if it didn't hear much.
Gary, did you want to add anything to that?
My experience
Did you
with
forget
hearing
the
aids was so lousy. I briefly had an analog hearing aid on this ear, and then I spent the money and tried a fancy digital one, and neither did anything for me. It was just totally worthless because there was so much distortion in the way my brain was interpreting the sound from my hearing that a hearing aid wasn't going to help it.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is, I guess kind of the frosting on the cake with cochlear implants is there are situations now because there are accessories that you can use, and so I find that I can actually hear so well in certain environments. You know, like for example, it's like, you know, as you all know, it's like iPhones. They upgrade and they upgrade. So like both Marcy and I have the latest and greatest cochlear implant that Cochlear has, and so there's just more kind of bells and whistles. Like we can use our remote for our remote. We can just use our phone. So those are just nice things that, I mean, the technology is just continuing to improve.
Well, I'd like to state on that. When I first got mine, it was 2 versions of processor back, and they didn't have the wireless. And after my activation, which is the first time you get the processor turned on, my wife and I had not been able to talk in the car because of the road noise and everything. And at that time there was a wire mic that you could plug into the processor and hand over. And we were talking on the way home, and she was in tears, which I implied that she was happy. It could be that she didn't like what I was saying, but she told me she was happy we could talk in situations where we couldn't before. I have the next upgrade got wireless. You have microphones you can place on a table if we're in a group in a noisy place to help you hear, or hand to somebody, and when they speak you can hear them. Now I'm on to the latest version like you have. Those parts have improved so much, and the processor has improved. I almost never use that microphone anymore unless it's a real noisy restaurant and I want to really just hear the people around me. So yeah, there's all these things, and they're getting handier and handier. And of course the iPhone people got the, I can use the iPhone first, but us Android users are catching up.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think the biggest boon, one of the best things for me, is use of the telephone, because for so long my hearing was deteriorating, and even though my hearing aids had these adaptive devices that you could wear around your neck, still there were certain people that I just had a horrible time hearing, like my best friend who lives on the East Coast, so it's not like I can have a conversation with her across the room. And now I can hear her perfectly when we have telephone conversations, and it's just so wonderful to be able to actually do business on the phone and not have to ask to tell the person on the other end, you know, I'm really having a hard time hearing you. Could you transfer me to someone else? I'm hearing impaired.
Right.
I don't have that same level of horrible frustration that I used to have. It's such a bonus.
It really is. Gary, can you remember any special thing that happened to you after you had your cochlear implant that you were missing before?
Oh, goodness. My wife and I were communicating. We learned ASL, and we were using sign language to communicate.
Wow.
If I wanted to speak with her sound-wise, I would kneel in front of her and read her lips with my head about 2 feet from hers, and I may or may not understand what she was saying. So we used ASL. If she had anything detailed to tell me, she would send me an email. So
Wow.
I mean, the biggest thing I got with the cochlear implant is simply communication again, to have that back. But at activation, the day that they turned it on, I understood her voice immediately.
Wow.
We left the hospital, and I just stood there. There was a cover over the entrance to the hospital that was made of glass, and it was raining. This was in Seattle, so of course it was raining. And I just stood there listening to the sound of the rain hitting the glass. That just, my wife's sitting there, come on, I'm hungry, let's go eat lunch, and I'm sitting there, but it's raining.
Did it sound like rain?
It certainly did. People talk about a robotic sound and everything, and to me, everything seemed reasonably normal right from the get-go with the cochlear implant. I then went to lunch with my wife, and the only seat in the restaurant that was free was in the bar. It's a very busy Mexican restaurant, and they sat us at the only table left, had a television 3 feet above our head, blurring out sound, and I was able to still talk to my wife and have the best communication we'd had in years.
Wow.
It's great.
That's really amazing.
Yeah,
I think for most people, it's not that quick. It certainly wasn't for me. Was it for you, Marcy?
I heard right away with my first implant. It was a little robotic. A couple of friends actually came with me, and we went out afterwards. And you know, it was far from perfect. I still had the hearing aid on the right side, but it really came on to normalization pretty quickly. I was amazed. It maybe took a month before it started sounding really normal, and then just continued in that process. So one of the other benefits is I've gotten into birding the last few years. I've taken trips with Audubon and and other groups, and it's wonderful to be able to hear bird sounds and bird song, which I had a much harder time with before. Also sitting in a van with a bunch of people. Initially, before I got my implants, I really couldn't hear very much, and I just sort of had to tune out and let people know that I was hearing impaired. And now, recently I just came back from a hiking trip in Arizona, and we traveled in 2 vans. There were 10 of us, 10 hikers all together, and the vans were seemingly almost no problem.
Wow.
I had a little problem, and with noise, but not very much. So it just has improved all those kinds of aspects of my life that were really obstacles before.
Simple pleasures.
Really simple pleasures.
And I think it's easy to forget that other people with normal hearing can't hear things too. I mean, that's kind of important to kind of keep in mind, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, one of the funny things is now, I'm 72, and a lot of my friends are kind of in the same age group, and in certain situations, their hearing is actually getting worse and mine is getting better. So in certain situations, I could actually hear something better than they can, which is, I never expected that.
Wow. And Marcy, you have great hair for a cochlear implant. I think I told you that when I very first met you. I was like, you've got the perfect head of hair for a cochlear implant. Well, did anybody want to add to that?
I think you do need to add to what I said. I mean, it wasn't perfect from the start for me. I did do the rehab, and I think people really have to appreciate that. There's some computer software you can work with that gives you different voices saying different letters and speech sounds, and for my first month I worked with that for 1 to 2 hours every day. And at 1 month, where I'd understood 26% of words before the implant, even with the hearing aid, at 1 month I was at 100%.
Wow.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you brought up the rehab.
And doing the rehab, I listened to literally hundreds of audiobooks. At the start, I'd have to actually have the text in front of me while I read it.
Right.
And progress from there. And so it does take some work. And I've had people that at activation, they could never understand a thing. It just heard beeps and buzzes. One lady I can think of, that's all she had for like 2 or 3 weeks was beeps and buzzes. And within a few months, she jumped right up there doing as well as I was. And you just have to work at the rehab.
Right. It's very unique for each individual, how it comes along. Charlie, do you remember doing the rehab?
Yes, very much. And mine was very robotic at the beginning. When they first turned it on, all of you would have sounded exactly the same, but I could understand the words. And you know, it's so far back now, and I hear so well now, I can't remember how long it took, but it was certainly usable. I went to Seattle for my first activation. I was there 4 days since I had to travel so far, just stayed there. And on the way home, we stopped at a Cabela's outdoor store. It was brand new. And I spent 20 minutes talking to a salesman about cast iron pans. It wasn't so much that I needed to know anything, and I wasn't keeping him from any crowds, but I could talk to somebody and we could communicate. I used to go into stores and just try to shoo the salespeople away because it was such a pain to try to talk to somebody when you can't understand what they're saying. The phone part, yes, I can use a phone now. I'm an introvert, so it's kind of a pain. I used to be able to tell my wife, just take care of the phone work. Now I do it because it works so much better. But I did use the programs that they had that were available back then. I have tried some of the new ones. I don't need it so much anymore, but just to see what they're like, and it really helps to practice. The audio books with the text, you're just retraining your brain. You know, I had gone so many years with such bad hearing, my brain was ignoring things, and I have had to learn to be attentive and then listen to the words. So yeah, very much so.
Yeah, I live alone, so I try to stream pretty much all day long when I'm home, and hear a lot of different voices, different news programs, sometimes foreign voices and things like that is really helpful.
And just to clarify, for the rehabilitation, you know, for people that have hearing aids and are just kind of wondering what exactly we're talking about, when you get a cochlear implant, you would take out your hearing aid and just rely entirely on your cochlear implant, and then like you all were saying, audiobooks or podcast or anything where you could like be reading it and hearing it at the same time. That's basically what rehab is. It's not like you're having to do calisthenics or anything. It's just all about taking time to listen. And then when you have 2 cochlear implants, of course, it's taking off the newer one or the older one and just relying on the newer one.
I found a lot of benefit from Angel Sound, the rehab software program. For me, I'll never forget the one thing that I got stuck on was understanding ama versus ana, A-M-A versus A-N-A. And the software would throw those 2 different sounds at me in different male and female voices. And I must have spent hours trying to distinguish ama from ana, but it finally clicked, and I got it. But you just have to stick with it and keep working through that.
Right. And having the word there, so your brain can, just connect the sound with the word.
You're using the neuroplasticity of the brain. You're building new, I guess it's synapses or whatever in your brain constantly every day, and by doing this, you're having them grow back in the right manner.
I think it's also important to point out that depending on how deaf you've been and when you became deaf, some people need to have speech therapy along with the hearing therapy.
That's
which
right.
all of us had hearing, probably excellent hearing to a certain extent, prior to getting our cochlear implants, at least at some point in our lives. So we didn't have to do that, but some people do.
Right.
I think that's been one of the real learning things about going to the support groups. There are people there who lost their hearing as maybe never had it or lost it 4 or 5 years of age, and then didn't get implants until much later, and they're still able to function so well, but practice and just have to do it.
Yeah,
Right.
And it also works for music.
exactly.
I actually bought a guitar when I was at my deafest before I was struggling. And when I got my first cochlear implant, I kept at it, and it sounded terrible, but it came back, and I just kept at it. I'm still a lousy player, but I can understand, I can hear that I am a lousy player. and when I went to 2 implants, it was just so much better.
I thank you for bringing up the music piece, because both Charlie and Gary enjoy music a lot more than Marcy and I, and it goes back to the rehab. Do either one of you want to, Gary, did you want to expound a little bit?
I did, my activation was in mid-November, so basically I went through the audiobooks and everything, so by mid-December I was hearing speech reasonably well. And my wife surprised me for Christmas. She got me a plastic recorder, you know, a flute-like thing, and a book, How to Play Recorder. And I had played saxophone for years back earlier in my life, and I'd never even seen a recorder before that, and nevertheless it turns out to have been probably the best thing she could have ever gotten me. I just started playing it and hearing tones and pitches, and I played the recorder for probably a couple of years, and then I said, hey, I'm having a hard time holding a pitch steady, and I need something that's going to, you know, give me discrete tones, and that's like a piano. So I went out and bought a keyboard and played around trying to play keyboard for a while, and then out of the blue I decided I'm going to get a guitar. So I migrated and went out and bought an electric guitar, and then I got an acoustic guitar, and then I got a classical guitar.
You can never have too many.
That's right.
I think you guys need to get a little band going.
I reverted back, though. I went back to the recorder, and in Portland there's a Portland Recorder Society, believe it or not. It's a group of wonderful people, and I played with them for a while, and once again I decided I have a big theory on this, and my audiologist agrees with me about why I'm not any good with the recorder. So I went back, I said, okay, it's back to guitar, but then I said, hold it, I'll try something new. So I went out and got a ukulele. So now for the last 2 years I've been playing ukulele, and I find that the more I play music, I don't care what the instrument is, the more music I can understand. Driving here today, I was listening to Baroque music being played on a ukulele in the car. It's
Well,
just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and music is an important part, and it's nice to know that it can come back. It's just a matter of doing, you know, listening to it. So one of the things I just wanted to add before we kind of wrap up, it's, you know, I've noticed that everybody I've met that has cochlear implants, they just seem to be so appreciative of being able to hear. And I think that part of it is because of the loss. You know, you go through this really bad loss, losing one of your senses, and then to be able to regain your hearing and regain it. I mean, it's not perfect hearing, I mean, but it's pretty darn good. So I was just wondering if you have any closing, if you were going to meet somebody with a hearing aid that was thinking about cochlear implant, any advice that you would distill?
Biggest thing I want to say is I was gradually losing so much life. I quit listening to music. Even when I had hearing aids and I could still work at work, music was going. And so now some of the bands that are old are new to me because now I can listen to them again. I couldn't go to a movie, you know, even if they had devices for closed captioning. It just wasn't right. Wasn't fun. So I didn't go to movies for years. Didn't go out plays, forget plays. I had no idea what they're running around on stage. So even with hearing aids that would work in a situation like this, so much of my other part of my life was gone. With the implants, with practice, with time, I've got all that back again. I've lost the jump shot, I've lost the jump, but I can hear.
Thank you. Gary?
Well, I think it's the hearing loss is definitely isolating. Like Charlie said, your life just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks to where you're not doing much of anything. And I live in a 55 plus community, and I know there are people there that just stay isolated in their house and never come up to the main center where other people are playing cards and things like that. So many people are isolated that just never show up to any events. The hearing loss isolates you from the world, and cochlear implants let you come back. Cochlear implants gave me, first off, communication, just to be able to talk. It gave me independence, the idea that I can go shopping now without my wife to tell me what the clerk said. And it gave me music. Those are the three biggies for me.
And we're working our brains, and that's really a good thing at our age, right? We're constantly working our brains. Marcy?
Well, I think for people out there who might be interested, it'd be important for them to make contacts with folks like ourselves who are more than willing to help them talk about what it's like, how our lives have improved, also what the downsides might be. For me, music has not come back yet, and I used to go to a lot of symphony and chamber music and that sort of thing, and I still haven't gotten back into that because music feels strange. So at some point I'm sure I will take some of the steps that you all have already done and made that more of a priority. For me now, it's more about getting my life back in sync, and I now have, I'm not as fearful of traveling on my own as I was before, because what if I'm in an airport someplace and I would have a hard time understanding with all the noise and so forth going on. So I've gotten back to much more of my independent lifestyle, and since I live alone, I think that's really important, so I can reach out more to people without feeling like, oh, this is going to be a bad experience because I'm not going to hear them, or they're going to be frustrated or impatient with me. So it really does give you back your life, and I would encourage anyone to at least take the first steps and to find out more information. There's a lot of help out there, both online and in person, and folks like ourselves who are very willing to help.
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier, but as my doctor said, and also Nicole Brent, who is our engagement director with Cochlear, that only 10% of people that could benefit from a cochlear implant have cochlear implants, and that's a lot of people that are not hearing as well as they could, and it's a direct correlation to your quality of life. So I just want to thank you all. You've just been wonderful guests. I feel very blessed to know you all. You've all helped me so much, and so thank you for much for coming.
Pleasure.
And
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Only 10% of people who would benefit from a cochlear implant have one. That's 90% of people who could live a better quality of life. According to Nicole Brandt, Cochlear's engagement director for the Pacific Northwest, there are approximately 400,000 people who are currently implanted. If you'd like more information about cochlear implants, please feel free to contact either myself or Nicole. Nicole can be reached at 206-753-9054. Her email address is nbrent, that's N-B-R-E-N-T, @cochlear.com.